What if the woman everyone laughed at understood every single word they were saying? "Can you even read English?" the Arab billionaire said coldly. "Or are you completely illiterate?" The luxurious Manhattan restaurant fell silent. Crystal chandeliers shimmered overhead. Wealthy investors watched with amused smiles. A few people quietly laughed into their wine glasses. Olivia Bennett stood frozen beside the table, her waitress uniform slightly wrinkled from a 14-hour shift. Her hands trembled around the tray she was holding, and across from her sat Zayed Al-Nahim, one of the richest hotel owners in the world. His dark eyes never left her face. "People like her," one guest muttered in French, "shouldn't be serving international clients." Olivia slowly lifted her head. Then, in flawless French, she answered him. The laughter stopped instantly, but she didn't stop there. Spanish, Japanese, Arabic, Italian, one language after another. The room fell silent in disbelief, because nobody realized the illiterate waitress standing before them might be the smartest person in the entire building. "Before we go any further, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there, and don't forget to subscribe, because this story is about to reveal a truth nobody in that room was prepared for." Rain slid down the glass walls of the Grand Crescent Hotel like silver threads under the Manhattan lights. Inside, everything looked perfect. Crystal chandeliers glowed above marble floors polished so clean they reflected the movement of every guest. Soft piano music floated through the five-star restaurant, while wealthy tourists and business executives sipped expensive wine beneath golden light. To most people, the restaurant looked elegant. To Olivia Bennett, it looked exhausting. She tightened the strap of her black apron and hurried past the kitchen doors, carrying 2 heavy trays balanced carefully in her arms. Her feet hurt so badly she could barely feel her toes anymore, but she kept moving anyway. Because stopping wasn't an option. Not when rent was overdue. Not when Ethan needed new asthma medication. Not when she still had another shift waiting for her tomorrow morning. "Table 12 is waiting," someone shouted. "I know," Olivia answered softly. At 29 years old, Olivia had mastered the art of sounding calm, even when her entire world felt like it was collapsing. A cook pushed past her, carrying steaming plates. Another waitress groaned while checking her tips. Somewhere in the kitchen, a manager was already yelling. Friday nights were always chaos, but tonight felt worse. Because tonight, the Grand Crescent wasn't just serving wealthy guests, it was hosting international investors, and everyone working there knew one thing very clearly. If anything went wrong, someone would lose their job. "Olivia!" Richard Cole's sharp voice sliced through the noise of the kitchen. She turned immediately. Richard stood near the wine station in his perfectly pressed gray suit, his expression already irritated. His blonde hair was slicked back so carefully it barely moved when he walked. Everything about him screamed control, or at least the appearance of it. "Yes, sir?" Olivia asked. Richard looked her up and down briefly before handing her a reservation tablet. "You're taking the center section tonight." Olivia blinked in surprise. "The VIP section?" "That's what I said." For a moment, several employees nearby turned toward them. The center section was the most important area in the entire restaurant. Celebrity guests, politicians, CEOs, and international investors were always seated there. Usually Richard assigned his favorite servers, never Olivia. "She'll mess it up," another waitress whispered quietly. Richard ignored the comment, or maybe he agreed with it. Olivia hesitated. "Are you sure?" "No," Richard said coldly. "But Amanda called in sick, and you're the only one available." He stepped closer and lowered his voice. "Do not embarrass this restaurant tonight." Olivia nodded quietly, but Richard wasn't finished. "These guests are international. powerful, educated. His eyes moved toward her worn shoes for half a second. Try to keep up. The words stung more than she expected. Not because they were new, because they weren't. Olivia had spent years hearing people assume things about her the moment they saw the uniform. People thought a waitress couldn't be intelligent, couldn't be educated, couldn't dream beyond surviving tips and unpaid bills. And eventually, after hearing it enough times, even strong people started wondering if maybe the world was right. "Understood," she said softly. Richard handed her the seating chart. "And Olivia?" She looked up again. "If anyone important asks a question you can't answer, smile and come get me. Don't try to pretend you belong in conversations above your level." Then he walked away. The room around her kept moving, but for a moment Olivia stood completely still. His words echoed louder than the piano music. "Above your level." A bitter smile almost touched her lips. If Richard knew the truth about her, he probably wouldn't even believe it. But Olivia had learned something a long time ago. The truth didn't pay rent. So instead of responding, she tucked the tablet under her arm and continued working. Across the city, a black Rolls-Royce slowed in front of the Grand Crescent Hotel. The driver stepped out first, quickly opening the rear passenger door before rain could touch the man inside. Zayed al-Nahim emerged without saying a word. Tall, composed, impossibly elegant. Even in the storm, he carried himself like someone completely untouched by the world around him. His charcoal overcoat fit perfectly over a dark, tailored suit. Beneath the lights of the hotel entrance, the gold edge of his watch flashed briefly as he adjusted his cuff. People near the entrance immediately recognized wealth when they saw it, but none of them recognized him. And Zayed preferred it that way. The Billionaire hotel owner glanced up at the towering building in silence. The Grand Crescent was his newest acquisition in America. Officially, tonight's dinner was simply a meeting with investors. Unofficially, it was an inspection. Because Zayed trusted numbers far less than observation. Reports could lie. Managers could lie. But behavior always revealed the truth. Daniel Reeves, his American attorney, stepped beside him beneath a black umbrella. "The investors are already inside," Daniel said. Zayed nodded once. "And the staff?" Daniel adjusted his glasses carefully. "According to Richard Cole, the restaurant is operating at the highest standard." A faint expression crossed Zayed's face. Not quite amusement, not quite disbelief. "We'll see." Inside the restaurant, Olivia carefully adjusted silverware at the center tables while trying to memorize the names of international guests. Luke Moreau, Sofia Alvarez, Hiro Tanaka, high-profile investors. She repeated the names silently while checking wine glasses one last time. Her phone vibrated suddenly inside her apron pocket. She stepped aside quickly and glanced at the screen. Missed call. Babysitter. Instant panic tightened in her chest. Olivia called back immediately. "Hey," the babysitter whispered. "Sorry, Ethan woke up coughing again." Olivia closed her eyes briefly. "Is he okay?" "He's better now. I gave him the medicine." Guilt hit her immediately. Every single day felt like choosing between motherhood and survival. "Tell him I'll be home soon," Olivia whispered. "He asked if you're still coming to his school thing tomorrow." Olivia looked down at her schedule taped beside the register. Double shift, again. Her chest tightened. "I'll be there," she lied softly. Because mothers sometimes lied when the truth hurt too much. When the call ended, Olivia stood alone near the hallway for several seconds. Then she fixed her posture, forced a smile onto her face, and walked back toward the dining room. At that exact moment, the main entrance doors opened. The room subtly shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but enough for experienced employees to notice. Richard hurried forward immediately, suddenly smiling wider than Olivia had ever seen before. "Welcome to the Grand Crescent," he said warmly. And then Olivia saw him. Zayed al-Nahim. The man moved through the restaurant with quiet authority, his dark eyes calmly scanning everything around him. The staff, the lighting, the guests, the service. For one brief second, his gaze landed on Olivia, and something about the look made her strangely uneasy. Not admiration, not kindness. Evaluation. Like he was silently deciding whether something had value. Then he looked away. Richard gestured proudly toward the center section. "Your table is ready, sir." Olivia tightened her grip around the tray in her hands, because suddenly, without understanding why, she had the terrible feeling that tonight was about to change her life forever. The center section of the Grand Crescent restaurant had become unnaturally quiet. Not silent, but controlled. The kind of atmosphere wealthy people created when power sat at the table. Olivia Bennet moved carefully between crystal glasses and polished silverware, keeping her posture straight, even as exhaustion burned through her shoulders. Around her, international investors spoke in low, sophisticated voices, while expensive wine flowed beneath soft golden light. At the center of it all sat Zayed al-Nahim, calm, unreadable, watching everything. Olivia approached the table carrying a bottle of imported Bordeaux with both hands steady. "At your service," she said politely. Richard had warned her 3 separate times in the last 15 minutes. "Don't speak too much. Don't improvise. Don't embarrass the restaurant." So, Olivia kept her movements precise and her expression neutral. Luc Moreau, the French investor seated beside Zayed, glanced briefly at her name tag before returning to his conversation. "She looks nervous," he murmured casually in French. Another investor smirked. "Probably her first time serving people with actual money." A few quiet chuckles followed around the table. Olivia continued pouring the wine without reacting. But inside, every word landed perfectly clearly. Because unlike what they assumed, she understood every syllable. Years ago, comments like those used to hurt her immediately. Now they hurt differently. Not sharply. Quietly. Like old bruises someone kept pressing over and over again. She finished pouring the wine and stepped back. "Would anyone like to hear tonight's chef recommendations?" she asked. Luc barely looked at her. "In a moment." Then, in French again, he added under his breath, "At least train your staff to pronounce Bordeaux correctly." More laughter. Olivia lowered her eyes politely. "I apologize if my pronunciation disappointed you, sir." Luc's smile faded slightly, because for one brief second, he wasn't entirely sure whether she understood him. Before he could ask, Zayed finally spoke. "Let's continue." Immediately, the conversation shifted back toward business. Olivia moved away from the table, but she could still feel Zayed's eyes following the room with unsettling precision. The billionaire noticed everything. A nervous waiter near the kitchen. A cracked candle holder near the bar. The timing between courses. Nothing escaped him, and now he was noticing Olivia. Not because she impressed him, because she stood out in the wrong way. Her uniform looked older than the others. Her shoes were worn. There was exhaustion in her face she clearly couldn't hide anymore. To Zayed, she represented inconsistency, and inconsistency irritated him. Richard appeared beside the table almost instantly, eager as always. "My best staff is handling your section personally," he assured. Zayed took a slow sip of wine. "She seems distracted." Richard's smile tightened slightly. "She's usually assigned to lower volume areas." "Then why is she here tonight?" "A scheduling issue." Zayed said nothing after that, but his silence alone made Richard nervous. Across the room, Olivia entered an order into the kitchen system while trying to ignore the tension building in her chest. Something about Zayed unsettled her. Not because he was wealthy. She had served wealthy people before, actors, politicians, executives, but Zayed carried himself differently, like a man completely accustomed to being obeyed, the kind of person who could ruin lives with a single sentence and sleep peacefully afterward. "Olivia!" She turned quickly. Richard was already walking toward her again. "The investors requested updated wine pairings. I already submitted them." Richard lowered his voice sharply. "Then why did Table 7 receive the reserve list instead of the premium list?" Olivia frowned slightly. "That's impossible. I printed the correct version." "Well, apparently not." Before she could respond, Richard shoved the folder into her hands. "Fix it, now." Several nearby employees glanced toward them awkwardly before pretending not to notice. Humiliation inside luxury restaurants always happened quietly. That was part of the culture. Olivia took a slow breath. "I'll correct it." Richard leaned closer. "Do you understand who's sitting at that table tonight?" "Yes." "Then stop acting overwhelmed." He walked away before she could answer. Olivia looked down at the wine folder in confusion. The pages had definitely been switched, but she knew she hadn't made the mistake. Still, defending herself never helped. So she returned toward the center section carrying the corrected list. As she approached the table again, Hiro Tanaka was speaking softly in Japanese while examining the menu. "There's a problem with the allergy translation," he murmured to Sofia Alvarez beside him. "This ingredient isn't listed correctly." Sofia sighed. "Does anyone here even understand international menus?" Olivia froze for half a second. Because Hiro was right. One of the seafood dishes had been translated incorrectly in the Japanese version. A severe shellfish allergen was missing. Her eyes widened immediately. If a customer ordered that dish, someone could end up hospitalized. She stepped forward carefully. "Excuse me, sir," she said gently to Hiro. "You're correct. The translation is incomplete. I already informed the kitchen earlier." The entire table went still. Hiro slowly looked up. "In Japanese," he asked carefully, "you understood what I said?" Olivia instantly realized her mistake. A tiny silence settled over the table. Then Richard appeared out of nowhere again. "There a problem?" he asked quickly. Before Olivia could answer, Hiro spoke first. "She understood me perfectly." Richard blinked. Olivia immediately lowered her gaze. "It was only basic translation, sir." But Zayed was watching her now with full attention. Not impressed. Suspicious. "How many languages do you speak?" he asked calmly. Olivia hesitated. "Just enough to help customers." "That wasn't my question." Something about his tone made the air heavier. Olivia shifted slightly under the pressure of his stare. "A few." Luke laughed quietly. "A waitress who speaks multiple languages. How inspirational." More amusement circled the table. Olivia kept her expression calm. Then Sofia Alvarez leaned back in her chair. "If she's truly multilingual," she said lightly, "ask her something." Richard immediately interrupted. "That won't be necessary. Olivia is here to serve, not entertain." But Zayed never looked away from Olivia. "Read this." He picked up the French wine menu and handed it toward her. The movement felt less like curiosity, and more like a challenge. Olivia accepted the menu carefully. Every nearby employee had started watching now. Even the pianist seemed quieter. She glanced at the page, then calmly read the entire paragraph in flawless French. Not slowly, not nervously. Perfectly. The room changed instantly. Luke's smile disappeared. Sophia straightened slightly. Even Richard looked stunned for a second before quickly masking it. But Zayed's expression hardened instead of softening. Because suddenly the situation irritated him even more. If she was educated, why was she working as a waitress? Why did she look like someone struggling to survive? Nothing about Olivia Bennet made sense. Then the moment broke. A server rushing past accidentally bumped Olivia's elbow. The wine list slipped from her hand and landed beside Zayed's glass. A few drops of red wine splashed across the white tablecloth. Tiny, almost nothing. But in luxury environments, small mistakes became public executions. Richard's face instantly turned pale. Oh my God. Olivia stepped back immediately. I'm sorry. Zayed slowly looked down at the stain, then back at her. His eyes were cold now, sharp enough to make the entire room tense. Can you even read English? He asked quietly. Or are you completely illiterate? As the restaurant froze. Nobody moved, nobody breathed. Olivia stood perfectly still beneath the chandelier lights, her fingers tightening around the edge of the tray in her hands. Around the table, a few guests exchanged uncomfortable looks. Others simply watched, waiting. And after several long seconds, Olivia slowly lifted her eyes to meet his. But there was something different in her expression now. Not fear, not embarrassment, something else. Something Zayed al-Nahim did not expect to see, because for the first time that night, the waitress no longer looked small. The silence surrounding Zayed al-Nahim's table became suffocating. Even the piano player near the bar had stopped moving his fingers. Every employee in the restaurant stood frozen, pretending not to stare, while secretly listening to every second unfolding beneath the crystal chandeliers. Olivia Bennet remained still beside the table, her tray pressed lightly against her side. Can you even read English? Zayed had asked coldly. Or are you completely illiterate? The words lingered in the air like smoke. Public humiliation inside luxury places always carried a different kind of cruelty. It wasn't loud. It was elegant, sharp smiles, controlled voices, people pretending dignity while tearing someone apart. Richard Cole moved quickly toward the table, panic written all over his face. I sincerely apologize, Mr. Al-Nahim, he said immediately. She's obviously overwhelmed tonight. Olivia lowered her eyes briefly. Not because she accepted the insult, because she knew exactly how moments like this usually ended. The poor woman apologized. The wealthy people moved on. And tomorrow, everyone pretended it never happened. But tonight felt different, because something inside her had finally become too tired to stay silent. Zayed leaned back slightly in his chair, his expression unreadable. Perhaps, he said calmly, your restaurant should hire staff based on competence instead of desperation. A few uncomfortable laughs spread around the table. Richard forced a nervous smile. You're absolutely right, sir. Olivia slowly looked up again, and for the first time that evening, there was no fear left in her eyes. Only exhaustion, the kind created after years of swallowing disrespect quietly. I can read English, she said softly. The room remained silent. Zayed's gaze stayed fixed on her. Olivia carefully placed the wine list back onto the table. And French, she added calmly. Luke Moreau frowned slightly. Then Olivia looked toward Hiro Tanaka. Japanese, too. Hiro blinked in surprise. Before anyone could respond, Olivia turned toward Sofia Alvarez. And Spanish. Sofia's expression shifted immediately. Richard stepped forward quickly. Olivia, enough. But Olivia continued speaking, not loudly, not dramatically, just calmly, like someone finally deciding to stop pretending. And Arabic, she said, her eyes returning to Zayed. "Though I speak the Gulf dialect more fluently than the formal one." The entire table froze. Because her pronunciation was perfect, not memorized, not broken, native-level smooth. For the first time all night, Zayed's expression changed, very slightly, but enough for Daniel Reeves to notice beside him. The billionaire sat straighter in his chair now, studying Olivia more carefully. "Where did you learn Arabic?" he asked. Olivia hesitated only briefly. "From a professor who said language matters more when people think you don't belong in the conversation." Nobody laughed this time. Richard's jaw tightened. "Olivia," he warned quietly, "go help table 14. But Hiro suddenly spoke. "In Japanese," he asked carefully, "what ingredient was mistranslated on the menu?" Without hesitation, Olivia answered him fluently. The pronunciation was flawless, natural, fast enough that several employees nearby stared in disbelief because they couldn't understand a single word. Hiro's eyes widened immediately. "She's correct," he said softly after she finished. "Completely correct." Sophia leaned forward next. "Then answer me this." She switched to rapid Spanish, fast enough that most people at the table couldn't follow. Olivia answered just as quickly. The conversation lasted barely 10 seconds, but by the end of it, Sophia slowly lowered her wine glass. "Incredible," she whispered. Richard looked physically uncomfortable now, because the attention in the room had shifted completely, and he hated losing control of a room, especially to someone like Olivia. Luc Moreau crossed his arms skeptically. "Speaking a few tourist phrases isn't impressive," and Olivia looked toward him calmly. Then, in perfect French, she replied, "You insulted my pronunciation earlier, sir, but the region you mentioned doesn't even produce the wine currently in your glass." Luc's face drained of color instantly. Even Daniel Reeves almost smiled. Because Olivia was right. A few investors exchanged shocked looks. Someone near the back whispered, "Oh my God." Richard stepped closer again. "That's enough," he snapped quietly. But Olivia's composure never broke. She wasn't trying to embarrass anyone. That was the strange part. Her voice carried no arrogance, no revenge, only quiet honesty. And somehow, that made the room even more uncomfortable. Zayed's fingers rested motionless beside his wine glass as he continued watching her. Everything about Olivia Bennett contradicted itself. Her uniform suggested struggle, her posture suggested discipline, her exhaustion suggested hardship, but her intelligence, that was impossible to hide now. "Who are you?" Zayed asked finally. The question landed softly, but everyone heard it. Olivia gave the smallest smile. "Just a waitress." "No," Zayed said calmly. "You're not." The tension between them thickened. Around the dining room, employees had completely stopped pretending not to stare. Even guests at nearby tables were quietly watching now. Richard forced another fake smile. "Mr. Al-Nahim, she's clearly trying to impress the table." Olivia immediately shook her head. "I'm trying to do my job." Richard laughed once under his breath. "Your job is serving food, not performing." The words hit harder than he intended, because several employees nearby lowered their eyes immediately. They understood that tone. They had heard it before. People like Richard loved talented workers, as long as they stayed beneath them. Olivia looked toward Richard quietly. Then she asked the question nobody expected. "Do you know why I never correct customers when they insult me in other languages?" Richard rolled his eyes slightly. "This isn't the time for personal stories." But Olivia continued anyway. "Because embarrassed people become cruel." The room fell silent again. She looked toward Luc gently. "Most guests don't actually expect someone like me to understand them." Then toward Sophia. "So they speak honestly." Then finally toward Zayed. And sometimes honesty reveals more about people than language ever could. Nobody moved, nobody spoke, because suddenly the conversation no longer felt like entertainment. It felt personal, dangerously personal. Zayed's expression hardened slightly. "You're implying something." Olivia met his eyes calmly. "I'm saying intelligence doesn't always wear expensive clothes." A server nearby accidentally dropped a fork. The sharp metallic sound echoed through the silent room. Richard finally snapped. "That's enough," he barked. "Go back to the kitchen before you lose your job entirely." Olivia inhaled slowly. For one brief second, hurt flashed across her face. Because despite everything, she still needed this job. She still had rent due. Still had a child waiting at home. Still had bills she could barely afford. And everyone in that room knew it, which made the humiliation even uglier. But before Olivia could step away, Hiro Tanaka reached into his briefcase. He removed a folded document and placed it carefully onto the table. "This contract," he said calmly, "was translated this afternoon for tomorrow's signing." He looked directly at Olivia. "Would you mind reading paragraph 4? Richard immediately interrupted. "That's confidential." But Hiro ignored him. Olivia hesitated. Every instinct told her not to get involved. People with power rarely appreciated being corrected publicly, especially men like Zayed al-Nahim. But something in Hiro's expression felt intentional, almost testing. Slowly, Olivia picked up the document. Her eyes scanned the page once, then twice, and suddenly, her entire expression changed. The color drained slightly from her face. Zayed noticed immediately. "What is it?" he asked. Olivia looked up slowly. The restaurant had become completely silent again, and when she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than before. "There's a major error in this translation." Daniel Reeves frowned instantly. "What kind of error?" Olivia swallowed carefully, then looked directly at Zayed. "The kind," she said softly, "that could cost you hundreds of millions of dollars." "The kind," Olivia said softly, "that could cost you hundreds of millions of dollars." Nobody at the table moved. The piano music had completely stopped now. Even guests seated across the restaurant were quietly staring toward the center section, sensing something serious unfolding beneath the golden chandelier light. Daniel Reeves immediately reached for the document in Olivia's hands. "What exactly are you talking about?" he asked sharply. Olivia hesitated. Every instinct inside her warned her to stay quiet. This was no longer a conversation about languages or humiliation. Now it involved powerful people, international money, contracts, the kind of mistakes ordinary employees got blamed for. Richard Cole stepped forward quickly. "Mr. Al-Nahim, I strongly recommend we end this conversation right now," he interrupted. "She's a waitress, not legal counsel." Olivia lowered the papers slightly. "I never said I was legal counsel." Richard's jaw tightened. "Then stop pretending to be one." But before Olivia could answer, Zayed spoke calmly. "Continue." The single word instantly silenced Richard. Olivia slowly looked back down at the contract. Her fingers tightened faintly around the pages. Then she pointed toward a paragraph near the bottom. "The English version says your company retains controlling rights over international expansion properties." Daniel nodded impatiently. "Correct." Olivia swallowed carefully. "But the French translation changes the ownership structure." Luc Moreau leaned forward immediately. "That's impossible." Olivia lifted her eyes toward him. "It replaces operational control with shared authority, Unsinn." Daniel frowned harder now and grabbed the document from her hands. For several long seconds, he scanned the paragraph silently. Then his face changed. The color drained slightly from his expression. Zayed noticed immediately. "What is it?" Daniel looked up slowly. "She's right." The entire table froze. Richard blinked rapidly. "What?" Daniel adjusted his glasses again, visibly unsettled now. "This clause gives the secondary investors partial ownership leverage if the deal expands internationally." Luke stood up halfway from his chair. "That wasn't intentional." Olivia answered quietly before anyone else could. "No," she said. "It was hidden inside legal phrasing most people wouldn't notice unless they compared both versions carefully." The restaurant fell completely silent, because suddenly, the waitress nobody respected had just discovered a catastrophic international contract error that an entire legal team had missed. Zayed leaned back slowly in his chair, his eyes fixed entirely on Olivia now. Not with irritation anymore, with calculation. "What else do you see?" he asked. Richard immediately stepped forward again. "This is inappropriate." Nobody listened to him. Nobody. Olivia looked uncertain for the first time all evening. She didn't want attention. That was obvious now. She looked like someone trying desperately not to become the center of the room. But it was too late for that. "There are 3 translation inconsistencies," she said quietly. "Not 1. Daniel's expression darkened. "3?" Olivia nodded. "The Spanish version softens liability protections." Sofia Alvarez immediately took the Spanish copy from the table. Within seconds, her eyes widened too. "She's right," Sofia whispered. The air around the table changed completely. The wealthy investors who had laughed at Olivia earlier were no longer relaxed. Now they looked uncomfortable, because intelligence was intimidating when it came from someone they had already decided was beneath them. Richard forced another laugh. "Well, clearly she memorized some translation terms somewhere." Nobody laughed with him this time. Zayed slowly stood from his chair. The movement alone made the atmosphere heavier. At over 6 feet tall, calm and sharply dressed in black, he carried the kind of authority that naturally silenced rooms. He walked around the table slowly until he stood directly in front of Olivia, close enough now that she could smell faint traces of expensive cologne mixed with rain from outside. "You expect me to believe," he said evenly, "that a waitress discovered mistakes my legal department missed?" Olivia met his eyes carefully. "I didn't say your legal department was incompetent. Then what are you saying?" She hesitated, then answered honestly. "I'm saying people stop paying attention when they assume someone else already has." For several seconds, neither of them looked away. The tension between them became almost unbearable. And strangely, for the first time that night, Zayed no longer looked angry. He looked unsettled, because Olivia Bennett was not behaving the way poor people usually behaved around power. She wasn't desperate, wasn't begging, wasn't trying to impress anyone. She simply kept telling the truth. And truth had a way of making powerful people uncomfortable. Hiro Tanaka folded his hands together calmly. "In Japan," he said softly, "we have a saying." Everyone looked toward him. "The loudest person in the room is rarely the wisest." Richard's face reddened instantly. Olivia immediately looked uncomfortable again, almost wishing the attention would disappear. But the night was moving beyond her control now. Daniel continued reviewing the contract rapidly. "Who translated these documents originally?" he asked sharply. Richard answered quickly. "We outsourced the international copies." "To who?" "I'd have to check." Zayed's gaze never left Olivia. "How did you notice the difference so quickly?" Olivia looked down briefly. "Because legal translation isn't really translation." Daniel frowned slightly. "What does that mean?" "It means every word changes consequences." Nobody at the table spoke. Olivia took a slow breath before continuing. "You can translate conversation casually, but contracts..." She glanced at the papers. One altered phrase can destroy entire companies. Luke stared at her now, with visible disbelief. You studied legal language? Olivia gave the smallest shrug. A long time ago. A long time ago where? Luke pressed. Richard immediately interrupted again. She doesn't need to answer personal questions. But Margaret Sinclair, who had remained mostly quiet throughout dinner, suddenly looked at Olivia much more carefully. The older woman narrowed her eyes slightly. Not suspicious. Recognizing. Like she had seen Olivia somewhere before. Olivia noticed the look instantly and lowered her gaze again. That tiny reaction did not escape Margaret. Interesting, she thought silently. Very interesting. Meanwhile, several employees near the kitchen were openly staring now. Whispers spread rapidly through the restaurant. That's Olivia? She speaks all those languages? She caught a legal error? No way. For years, Olivia had walked invisibly through those hallways, carrying trays and cleaning spilled wine, while people overlooked her completely. And now, in less than 20 minutes, the entire building was looking at her differently. It terrified her. Because attention could change lives. But not always for the better. Richard suddenly turned toward her sharply. You embarrassed this restaurant tonight. Olivia blinked in shock. I embarrassed? You challenged guests publicly. I corrected a contract mistake. You overstepped. The cruelty in his tone deepened, because Richard wasn't angry about professionalism anymore. He was angry because Olivia had become impossible to control. You're a waitress, he snapped quietly. Act like one. The words hit harder than the billionaire's insult somehow, because they came from someone who had watched her struggle for years, someone who knew how hard she worked, someone who still chose to reduce her to a uniform anyway. For one brief second, pain flashed openly across Olivia's face, and Zayed saw it, really saw it, not the waitress, not the employee, the human being. Exhausted, overworked, humiliated, trying to survive. Something shifted behind Zayed's expression then. Small, almost invisible, but real. Margaret Sinclair finally leaned forward. What university did you attend? She asked softly. Olivia froze. The question struck her differently than the others. More dangerous somehow. Richard immediately answered for her. She didn't finish college. Margaret ignored him completely. Her eyes remained on Olivia, and after several long seconds, Olivia answered quietly. I attended Columbia for 2 years. The table went still again. Daniel blinked. Luke stared openly now. Even Zayed's expression hardened with surprise, because Columbia University was not a place people expected waitresses to casually mention. Margaret's eyes widened slightly. Then suddenly, she leaned closer, almost studying Olivia's face now, and when she finally spoke again, her voice carried unmistakable shock. Wait, she whispered. The entire table looked toward her. Margaret stared directly at Olivia Bennett. You were at the United Nations Youth Translation Summit 6 years ago, weren't you? You were at the United Nations Youth Translation Summit 6 years ago, weren't you? Margaret Sinclair's voice barely rose above a whisper, but inside the Grand Crescent restaurant, the question echoed louder than the piano ever had. Olivia Bennett froze completely. The color slowly drained from her face. Around the table, confusion spread immediately. Daniel Reeves frowned. The UN Summit. Luke Moreau looked between Margaret and Olivia in disbelief. You know her? Margaret never looked away from Olivia. I'm asking because I remember a young woman translating live between 5 delegations without notes. Her voice softened slightly. People stood up and applauded her. A long silence followed. Olivia lowered her eyes. That was a long time ago. But Margaret leaned closer, clearly stunned now. "My God," she whispered. "It really is you." Richard Cole laughed nervously. "There must be some misunderstanding." "There isn't," Margaret said sharply. The entire table turned toward Olivia again, and for the first time all night, she looked vulnerable, not embarrassed, not ashamed, just tired. Tired of a past she had spent years trying to bury. Zayed al-Nahim remained standing beside her, studying her expression carefully. "You translated at the United Nations?" he asked. Olivia swallowed slowly. "Yes." Nobody at the table spoke after that, because the answer itself felt impossible. A waitress, single mother, working double shifts inside a luxury hotel restaurant, and somehow former elite translator. Richard immediately stepped in again. "She exaggerates," he said quickly. "People say all kinds of things to impress wealthy clients." Margaret's expression hardened instantly. "I chaired the summit committee that year," she said coldly. "I remember her very clearly." Richard fell silent. Olivia closed her eyes briefly, because suddenly memories she had fought to suppress came rushing back all at once. The conference hall in Geneva, bright cameras, headphones pressed against her ears, voices flowing rapidly through multiple languages while diplomats stared in disbelief at the young American student translating without hesitation. Back then, people looked at Olivia Bennett like she had a future. Now they looked at her like she was a contradiction, and somehow that hurt more. "What happened?" Sofia Alvarez asked softly. Olivia opened her eyes again. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then finally, "Life," she answered quietly. The single word carried more exhaustion than any long explanation could. Zayed slowly returned to his seat, though his attention never left her. "People don't walk away from opportunities like that without reason," he said. Olivia gave a faint smile that never reached her eyes. "Sometimes they do." "No," Zayed replied calmly. "Sometimes they're forced to." The room became still again, because beneath the coldness in his voice, there was now something else. Curiosity. Real curiosity. Olivia looked down at her hands. Her fingers still carried tiny burn marks from kitchen trays and years of restaurant work. Not long ago, those same hands had once held international translation awards. It almost felt like another person's life. "My father died during my second year at Columbia," she said softly. Nobody interrupted. "My mother got sick a few months later." She paused briefly. "And medical bills don't care how talented you are." Margaret's face softened immediately. Olivia continued quietly. "I started working nights while studying during the day." Daniel Reeves leaned back slowly, listening carefully now. "At first I thought I could handle both," Olivia admitted. "Then my mother needed surgery, and eventually I stopped going to class." Richard shifted awkwardly nearby. The restaurant employees listening from a distance had become completely silent now, because suddenly Olivia wasn't just the quiet waitress anymore. She was someone whose dreams had collapsed in slow motion. "And Ethan?" Margaret asked gently. Olivia smiled faintly at the mention of her son. "He came later." There was no shame in her voice, only love. But Zayed noticed something else too. Loneliness. The kind created when someone spends years surviving instead of living. Luc Moreau shook his head slowly. "You speak 10 languages, he muttered. "You could work anywhere." Olivia almost laughed at that. "People love talent," she said quietly, "until talent comes packaged inside poverty." Nobody argued with her, because everyone sitting there understood exactly what she meant. Zayed's jaw tightened slightly. The sentence hit harder than he expected. Maybe because earlier that same evening, he had done exactly what she described. judged her before hearing a single real word from her. Before anyone could speak again, Daniel's phone buzzed sharply against the table. He glanced down at the screen, then immediately stood. "Excuse me." He stepped several feet away before answering quietly. The conversation lasted less than a minute, but when Daniel returned, his expression had completely changed. "What is it?" Zayed asked. Daniel looked directly at him. "I contacted the legal team, and they reviewed the contract again." He hesitated. "Olivia prevented a catastrophic signing tonight." The investors exchanged stunned looks. Daniel placed the documents back onto the table carefully. "If we signed those terms tomorrow morning, secondary ownership claims could have triggered international litigation within 6 months." Sophia stared at Olivia openly now. "You saved the deal." Olivia shook her head immediately. "I just noticed the wording." "No," Daniel corrected quietly. "You saved the company." The weight of the sentence settled heavily across the room. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. Then Richard forced another tight smile. "Well, thankfully we caught it in time." Zayed slowly turned toward him. Something cold entered his expression again. "We?" he repeated. Richard immediately stiffened. "I only meant, you publicly humiliated the person who discovered the mistake," Zayed interrupted calmly. The restaurant air suddenly felt dangerous. Richard swallowed hard. "She's still an employee, sir. And you're still a manager," Zayed replied evenly. "Yet she noticed what your executives missed." Nobody moved. Richard's face reddened slightly. The shift in power was becoming obvious now, and everyone could feel it. Before Richard could respond again, Margaret suddenly frowned toward the restaurant hallway. "Wait," she said quietly. Her eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "I've seen this before," and Olivia's expression changed instantly. A tiny flicker of panic. Margaret noticed it immediately. "You've corrected international guests here before, haven't you?" Olivia remained silent. Margaret turned toward Richard slowly. "How long has she worked for you?" Richard hesitated. "About 4 years." Margaret stared at him in disbelief. "You kept someone with her abilities serving tables for 4 years?" Richard forced a defensive laugh. "She never applied for anything else." But something about the answer felt wrong. Very wrong. And Zayed noticed it immediately. The billionaire leaned back slowly, his eyes moving between Richard and Olivia with growing suspicion. Then Daniel spoke again. "There's more." Everyone turned toward him. Daniel adjusted his glasses carefully. "The legal department checked internal notes from previous international dinners." Olivia looked confused now. Daniel opened a file on his phone. "There are at least 7 recorded incidents where translation or cultural misunderstandings were corrected before reaching guests." Richard answered too quickly. "Our management team handles those situations." Daniel looked directly at him. "No," he said quietly. "The reports specifically mention Olivia Bennett." The restaurant fell silent once more. Olivia slowly closed her eyes, because now the truth she had hidden for years was beginning to rise to the surface. And Richard Cole suddenly looked terrified. Richard Cole suddenly looked terrified. The expression appeared only for a second, but Zayed al-Nahim saw it immediately. And men like Zayed had built empires by recognizing fear. The billionaire leaned back slowly in his chair, while the restaurant remained trapped in heavy silence around him. Employees stood frozen near the kitchen entrance. The investors stared openly now. Even guests at nearby tables had stopped pretending not to listen. Daniel Reeves lowered his phone carefully. "There are records dating back almost 4 years," he said. "Guest complaints resolved quietly. Translation corrections. Cultural misunderstandings avoided before they escalated." His eyes moved toward Olivia. "All connected to her." Richard forced a weak laugh. "Well, Olivia likes helping people." Nobody responded, because the tension in the room had changed completely. This was no longer about a waitress embarrassing herself in front of wealthy guests. Now it felt like something hidden was beginning to crack open. Margaret Sinclair folded her hands together slowly. "You should have been promoted years ago," she said quietly to Olivia. Olivia immediately shook her head. "It's not important." "That's not true," Margaret replied gently. "Someone made sure it wasn't important." Richard's jaw tightened. "Let's not exaggerate." But Zayed's attention had shifted entirely now, not toward Olivia, toward Richard, because the manager kept interrupting too quickly, defending too aggressively, like a man afraid of where the conversation might lead. And suddenly, another memory stirred quietly inside Zayed's mind. Small at first, barely noticeable. A crowded airport terminal, rain against enormous glass windows. A young woman speaking rapid Arabic to help an elderly traveler who had missed a connection. Zayed frowned faintly. The memory felt incomplete, like trying to see through fog. Olivia noticed the change in his expression immediately, and for the first time all evening, she looked nervous. Real nervousness. Not fear of humiliation, fear of recognition. Zayed studied her face carefully now. "You said you learned Arabic from a professor," he said slowly. Olivia nodded once. "Yes. But your accent," he narrowed his eyes slightly. "It sounds lived in." The restaurant became still again. Olivia lowered her gaze briefly. "I practiced a lot." "No," Zayed said quietly. "That's not it." Daniel glanced between them in confusion. "What are you talking about?" Zayed ignored him completely. His memory kept pulling harder now. Chicago O'Hare Airport. 7 years ago. He had been traveling anonymously during one of his company's internal audits, intentionally dressed modestly to observe how employees treated ordinary people. Most ignored him. Some were rude. One airline representative refused to help him after assuming he couldn't afford a business-class correction. And then, someone stepped in. A young American woman carrying textbooks, dark coat, tired eyes, calm voice. She had translated between Arabic and English for nearly 30 minutes without asking for anything in return. Zayed sat straighter suddenly. Straighter. Olivia noticed immediately, and her expression changed. Just slightly, but enough. "You," Zayed said softly. The word barely left his mouth, yet the air around the table tightened instantly. Olivia's fingers curled faintly against the edge of the tray she still carried. Zayed stared at her now with growing disbelief. The airport. Nobody understood what he meant, except Olivia. "You helped an older man arguing with airline staff." Olivia said nothing. Zayed continued slowly. "There was a delayed international transfer." His voice became quieter. "You translated for him." Margaret looked confused. "What airport?" "Chicago," Zayed answered without looking away from Olivia. Daniel blinked in surprise. "That was you?" Olivia finally exhaled softly. "I didn't know who he was." The room fell silent once more, and suddenly the billionaire understood something deeply uncomfortable. Years before tonight, before the luxury restaurant, before the humiliation, before he called her illiterate, Olivia Bennett had already helped him once, without recognition, without reward, without knowing his name. Zayed stared at her carefully. "You remembered me?" Olivia hesitated, then gave the smallest nod. "You looked different tonight," she admitted softly. "But your voice was the same." Something inside Zayed shifted painfully at those words, because Olivia had recognized him hours ago. And still, she served his table politely while he insulted her publicly. Daniel leaned forward in disbelief. "You never mentioned that before?" Olivia gave a faint, tired smile. It didn't seem important. But to Zayed, it suddenly felt very important, because the memory coming back to him carried another detail, too. He remembered offering her money afterward, and she refused it. Instead, she had smiled politely and said something he never forgot. Everyone deserves dignity when they're struggling. At the time, Zayed assumed she was speaking about the elderly traveler. Now he wondered if she had been speaking about herself, too. Luc Moreau shook his head slowly. This is unbelievable. No, Margaret corrected softly. This is what happens when people stop seeing workers as human beings. The sentence landed heavily across the room, especially on Richard. The manager cleared his throat quickly. Olivia always exaggerates how close she was to these situations. Nobody even looked at him now. For the first time in years, Richard Cole was losing control of the room entirely, and panic was beginning to show through the cracks. Olivia looked exhausted, not triumphant, not proud, just emotionally drained, because every buried part of her life was being dragged into the light all at once. I never wanted any of this attention, she admitted quietly. Margaret's eyes softened. What did you want? Olivia looked toward the rain outside the restaurant windows. A stable life for my son. The simplicity of the answer silenced everyone again. No grand ambition, no bitterness, no revenge, just survival. And somehow that made the truth even sadder. Zayed leaned back slowly, studying her with entirely different eyes now. Not as a waitress, not even as an employee. As someone the world had failed repeatedly. Someone talented enough to stand beside diplomats and executives, yet trapped carrying trays because life had collapsed at exactly the wrong moment. Then Daniel's phone buzzed again. He glanced down quickly. And this time, his expression became even more serious. What now? Zayed asked. Daniel hesitated, then looked directly at him. I requested archived recruitment records from the Al-Nahim International Fellowship Program. Olivia's eyes widened immediately. A flash of panic crossed her face. Richard noticed it too, and suddenly, he looked even more afraid than before. Zayed narrowed his eyes. What records? Daniel swallowed carefully. There's an applicant file connected to Olivia Bennett. The room froze. Olivia immediately stepped backward. Daniel, but he continued. The file was marked as selected for executive consideration 6 years ago. Margaret stared openly now. Luke looked stunned. Even Sophia covered her mouth slightly in disbelief. Zayed slowly stood again. His voice lowered dangerously. Selected. By who? Daniel looked at the screen one more time, then answered quietly. By your company. The entire restaurant fell silent, because suddenly, the waitress Zayed Al-Nahim, publicly called Illiterate, had once been chosen by his own global organization as one of the most gifted young language specialists in the country. And Richard Cole looked like a man whose secrets were finally about to destroy him. The entire restaurant stood frozen in silence. Crystal glasses remained untouched. Half-finished conversations died mid-sentence. Even the rain outside the massive Manhattan windows seemed quieter now, because one truth had just shattered the room completely. The waitress Zayed Al-Nahim, publicly called Illiterate, had once been selected by his own company as one of the most gifted young language specialists in America. Daniel Reeves slowly lowered his phone. No one spoke. No one breathed. And at the center of it all stood Olivia Bennett, her face pale beneath the chandelier light. Selected for executive consideration, Daniel repeated quietly. 6 years ago. Zayed stared directly at Olivia. You applied to my fellowship program? Olivia swallowed hard. Yes. The answer hit the room like another explosion. Margaret Sinclair leaned back slowly in disbelief. That program only accepted extraordinary candidates. Luke Moreau frowned deeply. There were thousands of applicants every year. Olivia looked down at the floor. I know. Zayed's expression darkened with confusion. Then why weren't you hired? For the first time all evening. Olivia didn't answer immediately, and that silence itself felt strange, like she already knew something terrible was coming. Daniel looked back toward his phone. There's more in the archived notes. Richard Cole shifted instantly. Too quickly. Zayed noticed. Everyone noticed. The billionaire slowly turned his head toward the restaurant manager, and suddenly the atmosphere became dangerous. What notes? Zayed asked quietly. Daniel hesitated, then read directly from the file. Candidate Olivia Bennett passed all language assessments with exceptional ratings. Final interview invitation delivered electronically. Olivia's brows slowly pulled together. What? Daniel looked up. The system says an interview invitation was sent. Olivia shook her head immediately. No. Her voice cracked slightly for the first time. I never received anything. Daniel frowned. There's a response attached. Olivia stared at him in confusion. What response? Daniel's face tightened. It says the candidate declined further consideration due to personal limitations. The room went silent again. Olivia looked genuinely stunned now. No, she whispered. I never wrote that. Zayed slowly turned toward Richard. And this time, there was nothing calm left in his eyes. Explain. Richard forced a weak smile immediately. I'm sure it's just some administrative confusion. But Olivia was already shaking her head. I would never decline that opportunity. Daniel kept reading carefully through the records. There's also a local reference attached from the Grand Crescent Employment Office. Olivia froze completely. Richard's face lost all color. Zayed noticed instantly, and suddenly the billionaire understood exactly what was happening. Read it, he ordered. Richard stepped forward quickly. This really isn't necessary. Read it, Zayed repeated coldly. Daniel inhaled slowly, then read aloud. Candidate demonstrates strong communication skills, but lacks professional stability. Current management believes executive-level international placement would not be suitable long-term. Margaret's eyes widened. Luke cursed quietly under his breath. Olivia looked like she couldn't breathe anymore. Because suddenly, pieces of her entire life were rearranging themselves into something horrifying. I never saw any interview invitation, she whispered. Daniel looked at the date again. It was sent directly through the Grand Crescent Management Office. The restaurant fell deadly silent. Every eye turned slowly toward Richard Cole, and Richard looked trapped. I can explain, he said quickly, but Zayed stepped toward him before he could continue. You intercepted her recruitment file? Richard swallowed hard. It wasn't like that. You forged a rejection response? Richard's composure finally began collapsing. She would have left! The words burst out before he could stop them. And instantly, the entire room understood the truth. Olivia closed her eyes. Pain spread slowly across her face. Not dramatic pain, not loud pain, the quiet kind. The kind that comes when someone realizes years of suffering were never an accident. Richard ran both hands through his hair frantically now. You don't understand, he said desperately. She was the best employee I had. Margaret stared at him in disgust. So you trapped her here? Richard pointed toward Olivia defensively. She needed the job anyway. Olivia's eyes slowly opened again, and this time, they looked shattered. I thought they rejected me, she whispered. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Because suddenly everyone in the room understood the real tragedy. Olivia Bennett, did not walk away from her future. Her future was stolen from her. Quietly, systematically, by someone who knew she was too talented to remain invisible. Richard's voice became frantic. "You don't know how restaurants work. Employees leave all the time. I needed someone reliable." "You needed someone cheap," Sofia Alvarez said coldly. Richard ignored her. "She corrected mistakes. She handled international guests. She saved us constantly." Daniel looked disgusted. "So instead of promoting her, you buried her." Richard looked toward Olivia desperately now. "I gave you steady work." Olivia laughed softly, and somehow that hurt more than if she had screamed, because there was no anger in it. Only heartbreak. "You let me believe I wasn't good enough," she whispered. Richard opened his mouth again, but nothing came out. Zayed al-Nahim stood completely still, and inside him, something ugly was breaking apart. Because for years he built businesses around excellence, around talent, around intelligence. Yet tonight, inside his own hotel, a brilliant woman had been reduced to carrying trays while executives mocked her openly. And worst of all, he had joined them. The memory of his own words replayed viciously in his mind. Illiterate. The shame of it hit harder now, hard enough that he could barely look at Olivia directly anymore. Margaret spoke softly. "How many years?" Olivia swallowed carefully. 4. 4 years. 4 years serving wealthy strangers. 4 years believing she failed. 4 years working double shifts while raising a child alone. 4 years trapped beneath a ceiling Richard deliberately built over her life. Several employees near the kitchen were crying quietly now, because many of them understood exactly what had happened. Not everyone steals with money. Some people steal opportunities, and sometimes that damage lasts forever. Richard finally snapped under the pressure. "She wasn't going to survive in that world anyway." The cruelty of the sentence shocked even him after it left his mouth. Olivia stared at him silently. Richard pointed toward her wildly. "She had a child. No connections, no stability. People like her don't survive international corporate environments. To see." The words echoed violently across the restaurant. And suddenly, the entire room understood what Richard truly believed. That poverty automatically disqualified people from greatness. Zayed's voice turned dangerously quiet. "People like her?" Richard immediately realized his mistake. But it was too late. The billionaire stepped closer slowly. "She discovered legal failures your executives missed. Another step. She speaks more languages than most diplomats. Another step. She saved a multi-million-dollar international deal tonight." The restaurant became completely silent again. Then Zayed stopped directly in front of Richard. "And you still think she belongs carrying plates?" Richard couldn't answer, because there was no answer left. Only truth. And truth had finally cornered him. Olivia looked toward the floor again, struggling to process everything collapsing around her. The missed opportunity, the stolen future, the years she blamed herself unnecessarily. Tears finally filled her eyes despite her efforts to hold them back. Not because of humiliation anymore. Because of grief. Grief for the woman she might have become. Then suddenly, Zayed turned toward her completely. And for the first time all night, the billionaire looked genuinely ashamed. But before he could speak, Daniel's phone buzzed one final time. He glanced down at the new message. Then his face changed instantly. "What now?" Zayed asked quietly. Daniel looked up slowly. "There's one more document attached to Olivia's archived file." The room froze again. Daniel swallowed carefully, and then he said the words nobody expected. "It appears someone inside this hotel was paid to keep her application buried permanently." It appears someone inside this hotel was paid to keep her application buried permanently. Daniel Reeves's words settled over the restaurant like a storm cloud. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The chandelier lights reflected across untouched wine glasses, while rain continued falling softly beyond the massive Manhattan windows. At the center of the room, Olivia Bennett stood completely still. And for the first time that night, she looked broken. Not weak. Broken. Because there was a difference. Weakness faded. But broken dreams stayed with people for years. Richard Cole staggered backward slightly. "This is insane," he snapped. "You can't seriously believe— Who paid you?" Zayed al-Nahim interrupted coldly. Richard froze. The billionaire's voice had changed completely now. Gone was the polished calm from earlier in the evening. This version of Zayed was colder, sharper, dangerous. "I didn't take money," Richard said quickly. Daniel looked down at his phone again. "There's a transaction attached to the archived note." Richard's face turned pale. "A retention bonus," Daniel continued quietly, "approved through management discretionary funds." Luke Moreau cursed under his breath. Sophia Alvarez stared at Richard in disgust. Margaret Sinclair simply closed her eyes briefly, like she had seen too many talented people destroyed by smaller minds before. "You sold her future for staffing retention?" Margaret asked softly. Richard immediately pointed toward Olivia. "She would have left the restaurant." "That was the point," Margaret replied coldly. The room fell silent again. Olivia's fingers trembled faintly at her sides. Everything she believed about her own failure was collapsing all at once. The rejection letter, the silence, the years of wondering why she wasn't good enough. None of it had been real. Someone had decided her life for her, and somehow, that truth hurt more than poverty ever had. Zayed slowly turned toward Olivia. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then finally, "I owe you an apology." The entire room became still, because powerful men rarely apologized publicly, and billionaires almost never did. Olivia looked at him carefully. Zayed held her gaze without looking away. "When I walked into this restaurant tonight," he said quietly, "I judged you before learning a single thing about you." Nobody interrupted. His voice carried no performance now, no pride, only honesty. "I saw your uniform," he continued, "your exhaustion, your position." He paused briefly. "And I decided who you were." Olivia remained silent. Zayed inhaled slowly. "Then I humiliated you in front of an entire room." The memory of the word illiterate still lingered painfully in the air between them. Several employees lowered their eyes uncomfortably, because they had all heard it, and none of them forgot. "I was wrong," Zayed said finally. The simplicity of the sentence somehow made it heavier. Olivia looked down for a moment before answering softly. "You weren't the first." Those 4 words hit harder than anger ever could, because suddenly everyone understood something deeply painful. Olivia Bennett had spent years being underestimated by people exactly like them. Wealthy people, managers, executives, customers, people who saw uniforms before humanity. Richard suddenly stepped forward desperately. "I made a mistake," he said quickly. "But I can fix this." Zayed turned toward him slowly. "No," he said coldly. "You can't." Richard swallowed hard. "I was trying to protect the restaurant." "You were protecting yourself." Richard's composure finally shattered completely. "You don't understand what this industry is like," he snapped. "Do you know how hard it is keeping talented employees? She solved every problem this place had." Olivia closed her eyes briefly. Because even now, Richard still didn't understand what he had truly stolen. Not a worker. A future. Zayed's voice became deadly calm. You manipulated company recruitment records. Richard said nothing. You forged correspondence. Silence. You buried a qualified candidate because you valued convenience over her life. Richard looked around desperately now, searching for support from anyone in the room. No one defended him. Not a single person. Because truth had stripped away every excuse. Zayed glanced toward Daniel. Terminate him. Richard's head snapped upward instantly. What? Effective immediately. Panic exploded across Richard's face. You can't do that over one misunderstanding. Zayed stepped closer slowly. This wasn't a misunderstanding. His eyes hardened. This was cruelty disguised as management. The sentence cut through the room like glass. Several employees near the kitchen looked visibly emotional now, because for years Richard ruled the restaurant through intimidation and humiliation. And finally, someone powerful was holding him accountable. Richard looked toward Olivia desperately. Tell him, he pleaded. Tell him how much I covered for you. Olivia stared at him quietly, then spoke the most devastating truth of the entire night. You made me grateful for surviving things you caused. Richard went silent, because there was no defense against that. Security quietly entered the restaurant moments later. Nobody needed instructions. The entire room already understood what was happening. Richard looked around one final time, as if expecting sympathy, but all he found were faces filled with disappointment and fear, because many people suddenly realized how easily greatness could be buried when it arrived wearing the wrong clothes. As security escorted Richard toward the exit, the restaurant remained silent. No applause, no celebration, only heavy reflection. Then, after the doors finally closed behind him, the room exhaled. Olivia stood motionless near the table, emotionally drained beyond words. Everything inside her felt numb. The stolen opportunity, the humiliation, the public exposure, the apology. It all felt unreal. Zayed approached her slowly again. But this time, there was no arrogance left in him, only respect. Olivia. She looked up carefully. I want you to come work for Al Nahim International. The words stunned the entire room again. Daniel blinked slightly. Margaret smiled faintly. Luke looked impressed. But Olivia simply looked tired. I can't. Zayed frowned slightly. Why? A sad smile touched her face. Because I don't know if this offer is for my skills, she said softly, or for your guilt. The honesty of the answer hit him hard, and she was right. Part of him did feel guilty, deeply guilty, but another part, a part he could no longer deny, genuinely respected her brilliance. You saved my company tonight, Zayed said quietly. I corrected a contract. You revealed the truth. Olivia looked toward the rain outside the windows. For years, she imagined what life might have been if someone had simply opened one door for her instead of closing it. And now, suddenly, that same door stood open again. But trusting it felt terrifying. What position? She asked quietly. Zayed answered without hesitation. Director of International Guest Relations. Several employees gasped softly. It was an executive-level role, one most people spent decades trying to reach. Olivia almost laughed in disbelief. A waitress to director overnight? She whispered. No, Zayed corrected gently. A brilliant woman finally being seen correctly. Tears filled Olivia's eyes again, despite her efforts to stay composed. But before she could answer, she slowly shook her head. One condition. Zayed watched her carefully. What condition? Olivia looked around the restaurant, at the exhausted servers, the frightened kitchen staff, The invisible workers nobody important usually noticed. Then she looked back at Zayed. "If I accept," she said softly, "this place changes." The billionaire narrowed his eyes slightly. "How?" "No employee gets treated like they're disposable ever again." The room fell silent once more, because suddenly everyone understood. Olivia Bennet wasn't thinking about revenge. She was thinking about everyone still trapped beneath people like Richard Cole. And Zayed realized in that moment that was exactly why she deserved the position. 3 months later, the Grand Crescent Hotel looked completely different. The marble floors still gleamed beneath crystal chandeliers. The piano still played softly through the dining room every evening. Wealthy guests still filled the restaurant with designer suits, expensive watches, and polished conversations. But the atmosphere had changed, not because of the decor, because of the people. For the first time in years, employees smiled without fear when management walked by. Servers were no longer publicly humiliated for small mistakes. Kitchen staff received proper breaks. International workers were offered language assistance and career training instead of being treated like disposable labor. And at the center of all those changes was Olivia Bennet. She walked through the hotel lobby wearing a tailored navy business suit instead of a waitress uniform now. A silver identification badge rested near her shoulder. Director of International Guest Relations. The title still felt unreal sometimes, even after months, even after the official announcement, even after newspapers published stories calling her the waitress who saved $1 billion deal. Olivia still occasionally caught herself reaching for trays that were no longer there. Trauma had memory, but so did hope. "Mom!" a small voice suddenly echoed through the lobby. Olivia turned immediately. 5-year-old Ethan Bennett came running across the polished floor with a huge grin on his face, his tiny backpack bouncing against his shoulders. Olivia knelt instantly and hugged him tightly. "You're early," she laughed softly. "He wanted to see the ballroom again," the babysitter explained with a smile. Ethan looked up proudly at his mother. "Mr. Zayed said I can have extra cake today." Olivia shook her head with amused disbelief. Of course he did. Over the last few months, Ethan had become unexpectedly attached to Zayed al-Nahim. At first, Olivia found it strange. The billionaire who once publicly humiliated her now spent weekends helping Ethan build miniature model airplanes in hotel conference rooms. But children noticed sincerity faster than adults did. And Ethan somehow understood what many people didn't. Zayed was trying to become a better man. Across the lobby, Zayed emerged from a hallway speaking quietly with Daniel Reeves before noticing them. The billionaire stopped immediately, and despite still wearing custom suits worth more than most people's monthly salaries, something about him felt different now too. Less cold, less distant. When he reached them, Ethan proudly held up a small paper airplane. "I made this one myself." Zayed studied it seriously. "The wings are uneven." Ethan gasped dramatically. Olivia laughed before covering her mouth. Then Zayed smiled faintly. "But uneven planes sometimes fly the farthest." Ethan grinned instantly. The boy ran toward the ballroom, while the babysitter followed behind him. And for a brief moment, Olivia and Zayed stood quietly together beneath the enormous chandelier light. "So," Zayed asked softly, "how many employees signed up for the language program this week?" Olivia smiled. 73. His eyebrows lifted slightly. "That many? Turns out people learn quickly when someone finally believes they can." The words lingered quietly between them, because both of them understood the deeper meaning underneath. Months ago, Olivia Bennet had nearly disappeared inside a life too small for her talent. Not because she lacked intelligence, because nobody important believed she belonged anywhere else. Now, every Tuesday and Thursday night, hotel workers gathered inside converted conference rooms, where free language and hospitality courses were taught after shifts ended. Dishwashers learned business English, housekeepers studied management skills, immigrant workers practiced communication training, and Olivia personally taught many of the classes herself. Not because she needed to, because she remembered exactly what it felt like when opportunity seemed impossible. "You changed this place," Zayed said quietly. Olivia shook her head gently. "No." She looked around the busy lobby. "We changed it," and for a second, neither of them spoke. Then Daniel approached carefully, holding a tablet. "The press conference starts in 10 minutes. Zayed nodded once. Outside the hotel, reporters had already gathered near the entrance. Ever since the story leaked about the billionaire and the multilingual waitress, media attention followed them everywhere. Most newspapers focused on the scandal, but others focused on something deeper. The danger of judging people by appearance. The silent brilliance hidden inside ordinary lives. The ballroom filled quickly as journalists adjusted cameras beneath massive gold chandeliers. International investors, hotel executives, and employees sat together across rows of elegant white chairs. And this time, employees sat in the front, too, not hidden in the back, not invisible. Olivia noticed that immediately. And she noticed who arranged it that way. Zayed stepped onto the stage first. The room quieted instantly. For several seconds, the billionaire simply looked across the audience thoughtfully. Then finally, he spoke. "When I first met Olivia Bennett," he said calmly, "I made a mistake that revealed more about me than it did about her." The ballroom became silent. Olivia stood near the side of the stage, stunned that he would begin this way publicly. Zayed continued, "I saw a tired waitress in a worn uniform and assumed I understood her value. Reporters wrote rapidly, cameras flashed. I was wrong." His voice carried no hesitation. "No amount of wealth protects people from arrogance, and no job title determines intelligence." Several employees looked emotional already. Zayed glanced toward Olivia briefly before continuing. "The smartest person in the room that night was the person everyone ignored." The sentence echoed through the ballroom, and many workers lowered their eyes quietly because they understood exactly how often the world overlooked people like them. Zayed stepped aside slightly, then motioned toward Olivia. The audience immediately applauded as she walked onto the stage, at first softly, then louder, then standing. Olivia looked overwhelmed by the sound, because for years she survived in silence, and now an entire room was rising to its feet for her. Tears filled her eyes again as the applause continued, not because of fame, because she remembered every lonely night believing her life would never change. When the room finally quieted, Olivia stepped toward the microphone carefully. She looked out across the ballroom, at servers, housekeepers, cooks, managers, executives, and ordinary workers who looked nervous just being inside a luxury event. Then she smiled softly. "There's something people need to understand," she began quietly. The room listened closely. "Talent exists everywhere," in complete silence. "In expensive offices," she paused, "and in crowded kitchens." Yem. A few employees nodded emotionally. "In universities." Another pause. "And behind cash registers." Olivia's voice softened further. "Sometimes the person carrying your food," she looked briefly toward Zayed, "might also be carrying dreams nobody ever gave them a chance to reach." Several people wiped tears from their eyes, and somewhere near the back of the ballroom, a young waitress standing beside the entrance quietly began crying. Olivia noticed immediately. After the event ended, the young waitress approached nervously. "Ms. Bennett?" Olivia turned kindly. The girl looked barely 19. I just wanted to say, her voice shook slightly, people talk to me the way they used to talk to you. Olivia's expression softened instantly. Then she did something nobody expected. She gently removed her executive badge and placed it into the girl's hands for a moment. Never let a uniform decide your worth, she whispered. The young waitress burst into tears, and across the room, Zayed watched silently. Because in that moment, he realized Olivia Bennett had become something far greater than an executive. She had become the kind of person who changes other people's lives simply by reminding them they matter. And somehow, that was worth more than every dollar he owned. True character reveals itself in difficult moments. Kindness matters more than status, money, or appearance. Never underestimate someone because of their job title, clothing, or background. The world is filled with invisible brilliance waiting for someone to believe in it. If this story touched your heart, comment where you're watching from and what time it is there. And don't forget to subscribe for more emotional stories that remind us what truly matters.